Now we're going to learn how to graph a cosine function. Cosine functions are very similar to sine functions in how we find the amplitude, the period, and the midline. The actual visual for the graph does look a little bit different though. So let's go ahead and start with our amplitude. Amplitude, we always look at the coefficient of either the sine or the cosine. And the coefficient in this case is going to be a 2. So the amplitude is 2, meaning from the midline, we're going to go 2 units up and 2 units down to find the maximum and the minimum. So the max and the min are going to be 4 units apart. The period, we're going to find exactly like a sine function. Period, we're going to take 2 pi and divide it by our b value. And the b value is always going to be the value that is multiplying our x. So in this case, our x is being multiplied by 5, so we can say that our new period is 2 pi divided by 5. And 2 doesn't divide by 5, and they don't share common factors, so there's nothing I can do to simplify that. That would be my period. Then I would go ahead and find my midline so that I know where the center of my graph is. And since there's nothing being added or subtracted, I would say my midline is just going to be at 0. It's not being shifted up, it's not going to be shifted down. There's nothing I need to do for that. Now, I'm going to come over to the right side here and draw my x and y axis. That way I can start graphing this. With my midline being at 0, my x-axis is the center of my graph. So I will have an equal amount of graph above and below the x-axis in this case. My amplitude is 2, so I can locate my maximum and my minimum. My maximum will just be a positive 2. My minimum will be negative 2, because that is 2 units up and 2 units down from where the midline is. With cosine, we want to split this up into 4 sections along the x-axis to represent those 4 quadrants. The fourth one being the end of the period. So I'm going to go ahead and label this last one here as 2 pi over 5. Now, in order to find the first one, the first section there, I would need to divide my period by 4. So off to the side here, let's change colors. And I will take my 2 pi over 5, and to divide it by 4, I can go ahead and multiply by 1/4. And if I multiply by 1/4, I would get 2 pi over 20. And 2 pi over 20 can be simplified to be 1 pi over 10. So I can say that my value here on the first section of the graph would be 1 pi over 10. Now once I have that 1 pi over 10 for the first section, I can multiply it by 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever I need to find the second, third, fourth, or fifth section of the graph. If I multiply pi over 10 by 2, I end up getting pi over 5 if I simplify the fraction. If I multiply pi over 10 by 3, I would get 3 pi over 10. Now that I've got that much of my graph, I need to figure out what this cosine graph looks like. Cosine either starts at its maximum point or its minimum point, depending on if it's a positive or a negative cosine. With this one being a positive cosine, we would want to start and end our wave at our highest point, our maximum. By the time we hit pi over 10, we will have dropped enough to hit our x-axis. By the time we hit our second section, we will drop even further and go down to our minimum value. By the time we get to 3 pi over 10, we should be back to our midline. And by the time we complete our period of 2 pi over 5, we should be back up to our maximum value. So we first needed to find the amplitude, then we found the period, we found the midline, We put those three pieces of information on the graph, and then use that in conjunction with the fact that we know a cosine starts at its max or its min to help us to graph this cosine function.